Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded Podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Now, for generations, owning a home has been the heart of the great Australian dream. In 1996, nearly 3/4 of Australian households owned their own home, either outright or, of course, many had a mortgage. And in the words of leading demographer Bernard Salt, this was what he called peak house, the high water mark, where 3/4 of Australians own their home. Now, fast forward to the latest census in 2021, that figure slipped to 63%. And for younger Australians, the drop's even steeper. And while renting is far more common today, the cost of entry of a home's never been higher. So what's driving this change? Is just the market doing what markets do, or do we set ourselves on a path where home ownership becomes an exclusive club? So today's podcast is going to be interesting for you if you own a home, if you've got children who are looking to get into the market, if you're a property investor, but also even if you're not that interested in real estate in general, because there's a lot of other demographic and societal things I want to speak with you about, Simon, because home ownership is critical. It's integral to us in many ways, isn't it?
Obviously, it is linked to, a sense of belonging. It is the home. It can guarantee you a sense of buy-in into the country, if you will. That means that you literally own a small part of your land and you therefore feel much more invested into the ups and downs of this country of ours. So that's of course a reason to like it. It's a financial asset that is important. We know that in retirement, the single best indicator for not suffering from poverty in old age is owning the place that you live in.
So let's go back, Simon, to 1966. What did peak house look like in Australia?
Well, so peak house in 1966, we had 2 decades gone past the end of the Second World War. We had all of the baby boomers being born by then. The youngest baby boomers started to even buy their first homes because homes were cheap. They were available. They weren't, of course, as nice as they were today. These are houses
They were much smaller.
They are smaller. They didn't have bathrooms per se. You had the toilet in the back and so forth. There wasn't necessarily that great of a house, to be honest, to compare to today's standards. But you owned a house. You had the security of a house. That was rather nice to have.
Interesting, in those days, a single income was often sufficient to buy a house then, which it's not today, is it?
Exactly. House prices were like 3 or 4 times the median or average income. So that was very much affordable, all things considered, which is why we had such a high share, 73% of people owning a house. And that's of course very, very positive. But there is, when we look at the home ownership rate, a couple of technical things we must consider there. Of course, it's a reflection of how affordable housing is, but it is also a reflection of what stage of the life cycle the biggest cohorts are in. And so if you create this environment where, of course, the people that came before the boomers, the returning servicemen, we essentially push them into home ownership at very, very high rates. And so these are people at the family stage of the life cycle, the traditional home owning stage of the life cycle. So we push them into a house. And then with the boomers, which they are big cohort and they tended to be in the early 20s, which is, of course, a phase when you are meant to be a renter, when you're meant to don't be a homeowner. But because we made housing so affordable, even those people could start to buy a house. So everything worked in favor of, getting the squiggly line that is the home ownership rate up and up and up. What we see, for example, at the moment in Australia is that housing is becoming less and less affordable, but we will see the home ownership rate go up in the coming years, simply because the big millennial cohort, the biggest cohort at the moment sits 10 years ago, throughout the last 10 years, was in the rental phase of the life cycle. Now we're pushing these big cohorts of millennials from the rental stage of the life cycle into the more or less first home buyer stage of the life cycle. And even if they buy homes at a lower rate compared to other generations previous, that then still means that we see the home ownership rate go up. So it is an imperfect measure.
Now, just to explain to people who aren't familiar with what happened way back in the 50s and 60s, there was government policy to help return servicemen. There were return servicemen homes. The government actually built or organised the construction of a whole lot of estates to help, I guess, repay them for the duty they did for our country. And it was generous of them to go to war and look after us. So there were return servicemen homes. And then even in the 60s and 70s, there were first homeowner grants, very much like they are now. The government policy was very much to encourage home ownership, Simon.
Exactly. It was a proactive choice of ensure that people own a house. We discussed it in last week's episode about how this was linked to building up the middle class in Australia. So a high home ownership rate tends to translate into a rather strong middle class, which tends to create rather stable political environment because people then kind of feel that more or less the political system works for them, so they're more or less happy about what's going on. So there are positive stories happening there. Of course, we also had heaps of land available. And just as we handed out those loans to all of those new suburbs, we gave car keys to baby boomers at scale. Cars all of a sudden became affordable in Australia. That simply was the case because all of a sudden household, or more, not each, more and more households had two incomes. 1.5 incomes per household. So that means we had this initial spending capacity to buy cars. All of a sudden, if you can just open up land and you can make sure that people get to and from their house and still go to work somewhere, you could just make housing cheap. You didn't need to do something like expensive public transport to fix these things. It was a cheap way of building cities out fast. And because we only were at the beginning of the urban sprawl in the 60s, we didn't have the negative impacts of it just yet. The idea, of course, now we continue to sprawl the cities over the last 6 decades, and now the outer suburbs are really far away. And
Yes,
so you
they
have
are.
heaps of people on the road at the same time to get people into the city center, and that stopped working. But this was the beginning of this sprawling journey, and so the problems weren't as severe just yet.
Well, the census gives us an indication of how many people own a home, how many people rent, if they've got a mortgage. So how far has home ownership fallen since then?
Yeah, so it fell to 63%. So now 63% of us live in a house that they own or have a mortgage on, which is a 10% drop since the 60s. So that is significant. That is quite a bit. So these are 10% of the population that are now renting, that are now less financially stable than they could have been had we held on to the previous regime. That is quite significant. But that story still kind of tells a bit of a faulty picture because ultimately in home ownership, we want to measure the home ownership rate of a specific age cohort so that we can compare them over time. And so we do, of course, look at the call them early family formation stage, age 25 to 39. 50% of the 25 to 39 in the 80s owned a house. And now this is just over a third. So we further push this down. So that means in order to, we still want to own homes, so that desire hasn't gone away, but it becomes more difficult because it is more expensive. And so consequently, we push the home buying further out. So we become home buyers later in life rather than sooner.
Well, we've discussed these various demographic trends in previous episodes of the Demographics Decoded podcast. So if you're a reasonably new viewer or listener to this, please subscribe to the show and then go back, because at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2025, Simon and I did a series on the various demographic groups that was very, very popular. And you can go and see what the needs, the desires, the aspirations are of the various generational groups. And that's interesting in many ways. If you're an employer, if you're a worker, if you just want to understand how other people are thinking. So go back to previous episodes, but please subscribe to this show. So clearly demographics is playing a role in this, Simon. What are the other main drivers behind the decline in home ownership?
Well, it's the idea that, so when we say housing gets more expensive, that doesn't mean much. Housing needs to be more expensive in relation to the income that we have. And so what we've seen since the 60s is that the money that we earn for our work, our wage, that grew at a slower rate than the price that we need to pay for our house. So in the gap between money earned and money needing to be spent on the house, that gets worse and worse. So that ultimately drives down the home ownership rate. We also, of course, started to have banks that have become a bit more reasonable about their lending. So they go, you actually need to have a decent sized deposit to buy a house. That then made it harder to save up for this deposit. You needed to save for this deposit for longer. And all the while, your wealth was drained by ever higher rents and general living costs, which further pushed out your first home purchases. And then, of course, we start to introduce a couple of tax incentives that ultimately ended up favoring investors rather than homeowners. So this is when we talk about negative gearing and so forth. A capital gains tax is discounted. So all these things push homeownership rates down. Then you'd go, well, all of a sudden, where's supply going? Where's housing supply going? We didn't build enough, and we stopped investing into the state-built dwellings. So, and the pool of homes that were owned by the government continues to go down. Planning gets more and more cumbersome. It gets more and more delayed. There are more planners involved in each stage of the lives of the construction cycle, all meant to ultimately improve the stock of the dwelling stock. But it also slowed down supply and minimized, held supply back. And of course, we increasingly turned ourselves into a more and more of a migration nation. We took in more migrants decade after decade, which meant we needed to build more stuff to begin with. And all the while, we also held back the development of skilled workers, of skilled tradies. So we didn't grow this pool enough to keep up with population growth. As long as we have enough workers, who cares about the population growth? You can just build enough stuff. But yeah, neither of those things happened. You combine all of those things and it translates into a falling home ownership rate.
Well, it's not universal, as you said a few minutes ago. As a demographer, you'd understand, you'd recognize, you've done your homework, that different groups have different challenges. Baby boomers have a much higher home ownership rate, but millennials and Gen Zs, they're entering the property markets later. But this is also creating a wealth gap between the haves and the have-nots too, isn't it? So there are a smaller percentage of people who own a home at the moment, more renters. That's created quite a bit of anger, frustration, let me even say jealousy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not just a problem for the here and now. This will trigger down into the future because the homeowners of today have something big asset to hand down to their kids. And the renters of today, they don't have this big asset to hand down to their kids. Maybe the renters played their cards perfectly right and have a really wonderful stock portfolio or crypto wallet sitting somewhere, but ultimately, on average, they don't. On average, the vast majority of wealth sits there in the shape of a house in Australia. And if that isn't there, then we know that the wealth gap between the owners and renters is going to continue to increase and therefore create this intergenerational inequity, if you will.
Now, you've in the past discussed your concepts of what's going to happen to the political landscape moving forward, but I guess owners and renters have different voting patterns. We saw that come out at the previous federal election where there were certain parties targeting the tenants and saying how unfair the system is. How do you see the fact that if younger voters are locked out, how could this shift political priorities moving forward?
This is where we have to quote John Howard, who famously quipped that he never met a voter that complained to him about his house going down in value. So voters want house prices to go up. The vast majority of voters at the moment own their house, which is why the two big parties go, dude, we're not doing anything to make housing cheaper, because then the two big parties, you will lose votes to the other big party if you were to make housing cheaper. So everyone is just avoiding making housing cheaper. In the meantime, of course, the number of people that would housing want to be cheaper, young, low-income renters in particular, that number of people is growing. So they become increasingly dissatisfied with the political system. Now, 2% of people in the 80s voted for third parties. Now, a third of people voted for third parties at the last election. We know that this number will go up and up because essentially everyone under the age of 45 tells us in surveys that they hate Labour and Liberal, that they hate the major parties. So with every election, we kill 3 years worth of loyal Labour and Liberal voters at the old age stage of the votership, and we take in 3 years worth of young people who hate Labour and Liberal. It doesn't take too much creative thought to figure out that this will eventually lead to the demise of the two major parties in Australia. So that, of course, has severe social, political implications because we basically are afraid to touch homeownership, to make sure that more people own a house, to make sure that housing becomes cheaper. I think it is part of the death nail that the two major parties put in their coffins, so to speak.
It's interesting, though, because there was a number of political incentives for first homeowners to get people into the housing market at the last election. We've discussed this before. There's the first homeowner grants, there's guarantees. But while that will help a small group of people, and that's going to start in January next year, January 2026, when first home buyers are going to be able to buy a house in Melbourne with a 5% deposit with $50,000 in Melbourne. It'll be $75,000 deposit in Sydney. Plus, they've got to be able to have serviceability. That's going to bring a whole new wave of people in. So these incentives to help more first home buyers sound good politically, but it's going to do what every other incentive similarly has done in the past, in my mind, Simon. It's just going to push prices up further and making it difficult for future generations or even it's going to create another little mini boom next year.
Guaranteed. So it's guaranteed to lead to a little boom because you give more money to quite a few people. Or a higher borrowing capacity to people. And so they can snatch up a house. But the market, of course, reacts because we're not going to operate in a market next year where there is just this massive surplus of housing. We are doing this stuff to a undersupplied market. And in this undersupplied market, this will make the prices go up. And so you say, oh, well, so you just continue the game at the moment. So in the short term, this will be a big win for the major parties, for the party in power in particular, and that'll be a positive for them. In the long run, does it create a bigger share of society that cannot own their house? I'd say so. And I'd say that this ultimately leads to more people turning their backs on the major parties.
Now, a lot of people listening to this show are property investors, and I've got a vested interest at Metropole. We help our clients safely grow into generational wealth through property ownership. So some people would say, hey, that guy's got a vested interest. Why would he care about falling home ownership rates? But I know that there's always going to be a cohort of people who want to rent, who need to rent. There will be a room for rental property providers in Australia, private mums and dads doing this because the government's not going to do it. So I believe a healthy, accessible market supports long-term stability of the housing market. I believe it's also going to help the economy. People, as we've said a few times already today, are more wealthy if they've got the security of their own home. Rental stress, which we're currently experiencing, hurts local economies. It's not good for our society. And I believe a balanced market's more resilient in downturns. So I don't want people to get the idea that all property investors are greedy and think that the falling home ownership rate's a good thing. In my mind, it's not, Simon.
No, it is not. And it is, of course, a complex issue. And it's too simple to say, oh, there is a particular group of people that just want one price to always go up and whatever. Because ultimately, you always describe yourself as a wealth advisor and wealth creation expert. And that's what it is. If the environment was to change, your advice would change. But in
Yes.
the current system, essentially, you buy property and it magically goes up in value. That's a good thing if you want to make more money. That is the smart way to do it. And then the other perspective is, well, what do we do to create the maximum benefit for the largest amount of people? And then you adjust policy to that. And as you then adjust the policy, investment folks will need to come up with the then now most efficient way of building your portfolio, and so to speak. And that just goes back and forth. And
Sure, I've got a vested interest, but if house prices are to continue rising, it's going to mean Australians are going to have to remain wealthier because we've got to be able to be wealthy to be able to afford houses. To 70%, 60% of the population are still what's driving the housing markets, and they create stability because investors come and go. So we really do want a stable, productive, growing economy that people can afford to buy houses, because the wealth effect of owning a house means people then go out on the weekend and spend things. When you buy a house, you buy refrigerators and carpets and things like that. There's lots of little tentacles that go out when people move into a home site.
Absolutely. So quick reminder what the wealth effect is that if you're rich on paper, you spend more money. It's a hilarious psychological thing to me, where if your house, it's the same box, but whether that box is worth $1 million or $1.5 million, you spend more money if your house is worth $1.5 million.
Yeah.
And that's just psychology in action, which I find very, very charming as always. But that's how we view the world, and that's how we interact with the world. And ultimately, that's part of a positive story. If housing is reasonably high, we spend money. If it's too far down, we're also depressed. We've seen this with the Perth housing market a couple of years ago, where the house was worth much less than the mortgage that you had on the house. And so that is also not good for a consumer market. So ideally, we would want to have somewhat stable, slightly growing house prices and slowly have wages grow at a faster pace. This would be a nice and soft transition to a market. And I think theoretically, we could design an environment like this if we wanted to. Be nice.
Well, I'm going to ask you how we can design that. Now, I know you do have people coming to your seminars. You advise politicians, businesses, organizations. So before we go on to how you would advise the policy, maybe you could just quickly explain what you do and how people can benefit from the services of the Demographics Group.
Yeah, so we specialize in just looking, consuming, eating, breathing, living data, and just constantly trying to figure out what this data, demographic data, economic data, social data, what all of this tells us about the Australian people and what it tells us about the future of the Australian people. And then we try to look at this particular base of knowledge that we have through the eyes of our clients, either the conference audience or a boardroom full of experts looking at a specific company or organization. And we tell them this is what the world looks like through that perspective. And ultimately, I'm a believer if you view the world, any issue from multiple perspectives, you become a more capable worker, husband, father, whatever it is. And so that's what we do.
I'll leave a link in the show notes so that people can get in contact with you. I'll similarly leave a link in the show notes to Metropole, who help our clients safely grow into generational wealth through property, strategic property and wealth advice. We don't sell property, but we help starting by putting a plan together for you and helping you plan to become the person you plan to become at metropole.com.au. Now, we did start this. I got sidetracked a bit because if you're going to give advice to the government or politicians, what would you suggest they do with housing policy? Because I think we agree that a falling home ownership rate is not good for Australia.
Yeah. So, well, there are a couple of planning type comments that I have to make here. It's like we'd want to have more medium density, even high density near the transport hubs, near the big artery roads and so forth. But this would only make sense if this was affordable to build. At the moment, building high and medium density is very expensive, which is why we're not really doing it at scale. We're only building the top end of the market type high density and not the low scale, middle scale dwellings at medium density. So that would be really nice if we found a much cheaper way of building medium to high density. We could make this cheaper by giving big fat tax reductions on it, for example. Of course, I would always want to see the stock of the share of the housing stock that is affordable or publicly owned. I would want this to go up rather than down, which is what's happening at the moment. So I would still plead for a state-owned housing developer, as happened in the
Now, you
past.
mentioned that a couple of times before and in previous shows. By the way, if you don't currently subscribe to this show and you want to go back and hear Simon's great thoughts about this, just subscribe or follow wherever you're watching this show and then listen to it. There's other shows when you go back. But Simon, that makes so much sense that and it works in other countries, and Australia has done it before, that apart from private developers who have different incentives, having a public development arm, because the government's own land, have resources, have the ability to provide affordable accommodation that, let's be blunt, private industry can't afford to build.
No, that's so. I must always remind people that if we look at builders, property developers, this is a low margin game. I am working with a unnamed gigantic builder who has a profit margin of 3%. They build big fat hotels and office towers, $200-300 million worth of property thing. And they have a margin of 3%. You go like, oh, that's nice. 3% on $200 million. That's $4 million. I would like $4 million.
No, it's very risky to me.
Exactly. If the smallest thing goes wrong, you're building at a loss.
Yes.
And that is brutal. And so to go, these are just greedy bastards or whatever, it's like, this is too easy. It's a low margin industry. Okay, so what happens then? Well, these developers, these builders, they obviously look at the top end of the market first because this is where the margins are higher. So these businesses, expecting them to operate at the bottom end of the market is ridiculous. They won't do this at the moment. So who is building at the bottom end of the market? Well, you can, of course, you can subsidize the current developers to build there through public funds. That's one way of doing it. Or you could have a state-owned developer who builds these kind of things. And I know it's probably unrealistic, a bit optimistic, but I am hoping for the idea if you had a state-owned operator that they would actually see the weaknesses in their own regulations. And that would then help to improve the connectivity and the efficiencies within the system. Is this too optimistic? Probably is, but I still choose to believe it.
Yeah, I guess the question is, are they going to be able to do it efficiently? We've seen how governments run other infrastructure and
Yeah.
building projects. Having said that, it would be nice if they could do that, because I'd like to maybe finish off by just hypothesizing, guessing where are home ownership rates going to head over the next 20 years. Simon, I think without any change, they're going to fall even further, aren't they?
So the home ownership rate will, in a sneaky bit, first go up a bit, no matter what we do, because we simply take the big millennial cohort from the 20s when you tend to be renters and push them into the 30s and 40s when you become more likely to own a house. So the home ownership rate as a whole will go up and we'll be tricked by it for a little bit. If we look at the age-related home ownership rate, what share of 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds own a house, that'll continue to go down. So overall, the home ownership rate will go down. And at the moment, we're not counteracting all that much. I think we would be collectively better off if we were to counteract. And I would always urge for slow, gradual policy shifts rather than any kind of major, crazy disruption. But there is always the temptation to just, pull the chessboard over and just bulldoze everything, start anew, be kind of crazy. I want evolution rather than revolution. That would be my particular desire. Yeah. Would we see the homeownership rate fall below 60%? I think it might be possible.
That would be a real shame, Simon. But you have painted a clear picture. Home ownership has been slipping for decades, and if we keep doing what we're already doing, and if we don't change, it's only going to get worse. But here's the thing. I think we made it also clear the story hasn't been fully written yet. It's still our choice. We can decide whether Australia remains a place where the average person can buy a home and build their future, or whether home ownership becomes an exclusive club. And I wouldn't like to see that happening. So here's the challenge from our viewers, our listeners. Think about what you want Australia to look like in 20 years. Do you want your kids, your grandchildren to have a fair shot at owning a home? And if the answer is yes, then be part of the solution, whether it's through the way you vote, through the policies you support, or even the way you invest. Because the Australian dream doesn't disappear overnight. It fades when too many people stop believing in it. And I think for one, it's worth fighting for. So if you've found our conversation valuable, please share it with somebody you know, somebody else who wants to understand about what's ahead for Australia's future. And again, if you don't subscribe to Demographics Decoded, do that. And then you can join us each week as Simon and I share our thoughts about our future. Thanks once again. I look forward to catching up with you next week, Simon.
Awesome. I'll see you next week.